concentration with a handheld glucometer, calculating a dosage by hand or using a module in the EMR, and then turning a pump up and down. In fact, given the quality regulations in hospitals today, it actually takes 2 nurses to perform this once every hour. Given the diabetes epidemic that we have staring at us today, this doesn't scale. We just don't have enough critical care nurses in the world to face down this epidemic. That's what's led us to the system that we've developed. Our system is effectively a metabolic autopilot. Connects to an existing patient's IV line, uses an electrochemical biosensor to measure the glucose concentration among other analytes, and then using this creates an adaptive computational model of that patient's metabolism, infusing medication directly into the bloodstream to normalize their glucose levels. It's bidirectional, so it's insulin to lower the glucose levels, but it's also dextrose to raise and support them, so we can provide an active defense against hypoglycemia as well. We've done 3 clinical trials designed in concert with our friends in Silver Spring at FDA and executed through to completion with very, very strong results. So 97% control in the normal human euglycemic target range. That's not just reducing hyperglycemia, but it's actually creating a normal circumstance for that patient's blood glucose. And most critically, 100% prevention of dangerous hypoglycemia. Across 6,500 data points, 50 patients, we've never had a blood sugar below 70 milligrams per deciliter. For reference, this is what we deal with in hospital today. That's 8 charts of patients in post-operative critical care overlaid. You can see highs, you can see lows, and that reference level that I just mentioned there, 80 to 125 milligrams per deciliter, you see the blood sugar barely stays there at all. In contrast, this is what high-precision automation is able to establish. This is the 6,500 data points across the 50 patients that we've enrolled that I just mentioned. We just presented this data last weekend at the American Diabetes Association conference in New Orleans. Fairly strong reception there. Pretty happy to reach out to the clinical community and start sharing this. So you can see that not only is blood sugar normalized by 3 hours, but the variability in that blood sugar is progressively diminished over time. And that's critical for us because it allows us to align our business model with the incentives of the hospital, not selling expensive capital equipment, but rather offering hospitals a dependable per patient day cost of diabetes control through consumable supplies. We price those supplies at the cost of labor replacement, and that gives us a long-lived, stable revenue stream from each individual device placed, around $7,500 per month, about $90,000 per year. Market's enormous, so we'll start with the most acute areas of care. That's surgical and medical ICU. And in the United States and Europe, we see that market to be about 200,000 devices. And at the projected pricing I just mentioned, that's total addressable market of $13 billion annually. So it's a connected device for the connected hospital that we've been talking about for 20 years and still hasn't gotten here yet. But obviously, this is something that's increasingly important. We're information-driven medicine. This opens doors. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. First, tell you where we are. So we have priority review with FDA, the clinical validation that I just mentioned before, using fully engineered prototypes, and several families of patents already approved both in the United States and Europe. We're filing our next generation of IP this month. Right now, we're putting together our quality system, and we'll submit this and the final bill of materials to the notified body later this year, perhaps early next year, for CE Mark. That'll be our first regulatory clearance. We'll do a pilot commercial launch in the Nordics in 2017, put final data in front of FDA later that year for commercial release here in the United States in 2018. But this really is just the beginning. So the biosensor that we use measures multiple analytes. We already do glucose, lactate, hematocrit. We have the ability to do glutamine, glutamate, pyruvate, which are interesting to a number of different modalities of care in hospital. The treatment technique itself is flexible, so we're doing glucose control with insulin and glucose, but it's equally viable for things like vasoconstriction and vasodilation, hydration and electrolyte balance, coagulation, anticoagulation, lots of things that are incredibly important to critical care environments. And then the medication delivery technique. Each individual syringe carries a proprietarily encoded EEPROM chip that uniquely identifies it to the system. So we know the medication, the lot number, concentration of medication, expiry date, manufacture of origin, every single time a medication goes into this. So you have a unique way of preventing medication delivery errors in this particular system. And we think that that has broad applicability throughout the hospital as well. And then there's the data, right? So we have an incredibly powerful data set. We're taking we're taking physiologic parameters off the patient point of care at 3 hertz, multiple times a second with metabolic control data. If you want to take a look at where healthcare dollars are most efficient, you take a look at the patients who cost the healthcare system the most money. If you want to look at the ways that drugs interact with other drugs, interact with the patient's conditions, you do this in this patient population, you overlay data on top of this, and I think you have an incredibly rich body of information for pharmaceutical research, drug development, and lots of other things. So again, I think that there's a tremendous amount of power here. But it starts by treating the patient. So I'll leave you with a couple of thoughts and then chat about whatever you guys might be interested in. First, that this is not a speculative product. This is a direct answer to a demonstrated market demand and a pressing medical need. And secondly, that if we really do want to slay the two-headed dragon, so simultaneously improving healthcare outcomes, but improving the economics of providing those outcomes, we need to embrace high precision automation. So with that, happy to take any questions you guys might have.
Okay, let's give it up for Jeff. So I'll kick it off with one, Jeff. I watched last night. This is kind of odd that I watched this because I forgot last night you were presenting this morning. Watched Sugar Coated on Netflix. Has anyone seen that? It's really good. It's a really good documentary about the sugar industry, and it's not like a conspiracy theory documentary. It's kind of legitimately about what the sugar industry did in the 70s and whatnot. One of the things I picked up from it was aside from glycemic control, like the diabetic issue, there's a whole host of metabolic issues that this kind of epidemic is causing, right? Like the fatty liver, et cetera, et cetera. So have you guys kind of looked into what are some other metabolic issues that we could kind of tackle, whether it's like, having the gas pedal brake for, sodium and potassium, that type of thing? Are y'all looking at any other type of metabolic disorders that you could manage with a similar fashion?
Yeah, so I mentioned a few of them, and I think because we start in the critical care environment, it makes sense to start branching out from that platform. And the ones that I did mention, in surgery, coagulation and anticoagulation, hydration and electrolyte balance, which is what you just alluded to a moment ago. So those are a couple. I think cardiac factors is a really interesting one as well. There are a whole, if you start looking at troponin levels and what you might be able to do from the standpoint of predicting cardiac incidents, those sorts of things. I think you've got something that's incredibly high impact both to the patient population and to the cost of delivering medical care in a health facility. So yeah, I think there's a bunch of different things. And actually those are contemplated in our original IP. So these are things that we've been thinking about for quite a few years now.
Introduce yourself. Joe Calhoun here. Sorry, Joe Calhoun here. Yeah, me too. You said it took 3 hours to normalize, and I'm kind of curious how much preload. What's going on at 3 hours? How much preloading of patient-specific parameters is it, or is it just learning on the fly in 3 hours?
That's actually an awesome question. Thanks. So it's learning on the fly. So if you take a look at the patient demographic that we're looking at, so in surgical patients, something like 20% of surgical patients come through the ED, right? So if they're coming through the emergency department, you don't necessarily have access to that patient's chart before you need to begin treating the patient. So we use an adaptive treatment methodology that learns that patient's metabolic response characteristics on the fly. We don't depend on things coming out of the EMR. We don't depend on data being entered by the nurse. Literally, the only two parameters that the nurse enters into the system are the target glucose level for that patient and the patient's body weight. And as for the patient's body weight, even if she gets it wrong, the system will adapt to it.
Hey, I'm Guy Gallam over here. Can you give us a really quick bio of how you got involved in this, how you had the idea, and how this developed over time? Just a quick overview of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the genesis story of the project is actually kind of interesting. So on those slides, yes, look, there's us. So the guy there in the middle that you see, my chief scientist is an endocrinologist and nuclear medicine guy, about 30 years, who also happens to be my father. And he was working he was consulting as an endocrinologist to a health system down in South Florida when a critical care nurse called him at about 3 in the morning and basically ripped him a new one. Said, look, what you ask us to do to control these patients' blood sugars, number one, doesn't work, and number two, sucks for me as a nurse. I've got a patient who's bleeding in the next bed, and you want me to come over here and run your errands for you. So if you doctors are so smart, there's all this technology out there, why can't you build something to do this for us? And he rang me up. I'm a hardware and software engineer specializing in adaptive systems by background, and said, do you think we can do this? And being totally ignorant of the regulatory horizon in front of us, I said, yeah, sure, we can do this. Called up Glenn, who's been a good friend of mine for a long time. He's an industry veteran. So he came from the Johnson & Johnson Leadership Development Program and helped them commercialize a number of different technologies. We put our heads together, started with, well, actually, it started with drinking a lot of coffee and asking what the characteristics of the solution might be. We moved into an in silico model. Then we moved into, the early research done in the university environment. And finally, we opened an IDE with FDA and began human trials a couple of years ago. So that's sort of the history of the company. And at this point, we're finalizing the design, moving it into commercialization phase. We had day jobs back then. This was just a cocktail napkin sketch. The company's been going full speed for about 4 years now. And that's the time that it's taken us to do the early research, go into the university laboratory, come out, get the IDE with FDA, the 3 clinical trials that I mentioned, and the prototype engineering. It's going to take another year to get the device to manufacturable status, and then put data in front of FDA. But in the meanwhile, we'll have clearance to sell outside of the United States and start working on those distribution channels as well.
Valerie McNee. In answer to the question about the 3-hour window, I think if you had Papa Fox sitting at the bedside trying to stabilize that ED patient without the system, it would take 3 hours to get to that level. Anyway, you got to inject the insulin, wait a bit, draw another blood sugar, say, oops, good or bad, and then, you work your way down. So I think that window is built in however you.
That if you look at the trial comparators, most of the studies that have been published, even with good results, if you look at Fenari's trial or Vandenberg's trial, they tend to be on the order of 6 hours, 6 to 7 hours. Really, the data doesn't emphasize that faster is better. There's no clinical literature that says that. What we do see across the board is that more stable is better. It's the highs are bad, the lows are bad, but the roller coaster effect is incredibly stressful on a patient's metabolism. So stability is good.
I hate this thing. All right, so if I got it correctly, this is a device that's meant to scan a diabetes patient to determine the appropriate amount of things they will need to keep their condition stable, right? All right. I'm saying with a device like this, could it be possible for, if you guys felt like it, could you expand it into other diseases and conditions for emergency patients as well?
Yeah. So the technique that this is built around, we like to think of it as push-pull counterbalancing. So it's an adaptive framework for modeling that patient's metabolism that's really flexible. And the application of 2 or more biologics. So one to raise a physiologic parameter and the second one to lower that same parameter. So as long as you can push-pull, we can address pretty much any metabolic imbalance using this general technique. That's not to say that we can do it out of the box today. Obviously, it takes a lot of clinical research to make certain that you've got the right tuning and the right usability characteristics and all the rest around the technology. But from a framework perspective, yeah, we absolutely anticipate that this could be used with other metabolic indications. I want to get to know you guys. We've been in Little Rock for a while now, and one thing that I would really love is to get better plugged into the Little Rock community. I think the people that I've met here I've definitely enjoyed, and I would love to visit with each and every one of you and see what your perspective on what we're doing might be, and how we might be able to maybe get better acquainted.
Okay, get to know him. Come grab him, buy him a cup of coffee. He's a handsome guy, maybe a drink. Jeff, thank you. Everybody give him a round of applause. So Kim's going to come up. Kim has a quick announcement, and then we'll close it after that.
All right. Hey, guys. Thanks for coming this morning. A couple quick things. Super sorry about the audio this morning. We'll obviously get that taken care of by next week. And I wanted to let you know about a couple of events we have coming up. So next Tuesday, the 21st at the Hub, we have the Arkansas Angel Network Luncheon. So we'll have 3 presenters. It's open to the public, but you have to RSVP. Lunch is provided. So all of you guys are invited. Just make sure that you go on our website and RSVP for that. And then another event we have coming up is Demo Day, which is June the 30th. Also, everyone's invited, and you also have to RSVP, and it is here. 1 o'clock on the 30th, and the luncheon is 11:30 next Tuesday. Thanks for coming. I'm going to pass it back off to Spencer.
Yeah. Thank you to Lavis Coffee. I think we got him in the building. I don't forget where he was, but please tweet, hashtag, retweet, like, whatever it is the kids are doing these days. But thank you for coming out. Thank your eardrums for coming out as well. And have a great, you don't have to leave. Plenty of coffee, stay, hang out, talk to Jeff. But thank you guys so much for coming to 1 Million Cups. Have a great Wednesday.